In March 2020, New York City fell eerily silent as COVID-19 lockdown orders swept across the country. Streets once bustling with life were deserted, and the only sounds piercing the stillness were the wails of ambulance sirens. Sarah Parker, a 27-year-old graphic designer, was one of the millions trapped inside their homes. Her studio apartment on the seventh floor of an old, dilapidated building suddenly felt more like a cage than a sanctuary. The building itself was a relic of the past, with peeling wallpaper, creaking floors, and dimly lit hallways. Most of the tenants had fled the city, leaving behind only a handful of stubborn residents, including Sarah. But as the lockdown dragged on, Sarah began to notice something unusual. The building didn't just feel empty. It felt wrong. It started small, faint noises in the night. Sarah dismissed them as the groans of an aging structure. But one night, as she lay on her worn-out couch, scrolling aimlessly through her phone, she heard it clearly, a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from the wall adjacent to her bed. The wall that bordered apartment 708. She froze. Apartment 708 had been vacant for weeks. The last tenant, a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Jenkins, had abruptly moved out after her mother succumbed to the virus. Sarah tried to rationalize it. Old pipes, she told herself. Maybe a mouse. But deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, and then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. Sarah let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding, only to hear something even more chilling. A voice. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper. "Sarah!" Her heart slammed against her ribs. She sat bolt upright, staring at the wall. The voice was faint but unmistakable. It came from inside apartment 708. The next day, Sarah decided to confront her unease. She knocked on Mr. Jones's door, the building's elderly superintendent. His face was weathered, his eyes shadowed with worry. "Mr. Jones, do you know if anyone's been in apartment 708?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. He shook his head slowly. "Nobody's lived there since Mrs. Jenkins left." "Why?" Sarah hesitated before answering. I heard noises and a voice." At that, Mr. Jones's expression darkened. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You're not the first. Back in the 70s, there was a woman named Linda who lived in 708. She died there, alone. Nobody found her for weeks. Some say she never really left." Sarah's blood ran cold. "What happened to her?" Mr. Jones shrugged, his gaze distant. "Heart attack, they said, but folks around here always thought there was more to it." That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. The story of Linda played over and over in her mind. At 2 a.m., she got up to splash water on her face. When she looked up, her bathroom mirror was fogged over from the steam of her earlier shower. But as she wiped it clean, she noticed something strange. Words began to form on the glass, as though written by an invisible hand. "Help me." Sarah stumbled backward, her heart pounding. The words faded, but the air in the bathroom grew colder. She tried to convince herself it was a trick of the light, a figment of her imagination. But deep down, she knew better. The next night, it escalated. As she lay in bed, her phone buzzed. A notification from her live streaming app. Confused, she opened it. The app was active, broadcasting live from her phone. But she hadn't started it. The screen showed her living room. The angle was odd, as if the phone had been moved to face the wall. In the dim light, Sarah could make out the faint outline of something. No, someone, standing in the shadows. A figure with long, unkempt hair and a pale, distorted face. The chat exploded with comments. "Who's that?" "This has to be fake." "Get out of there!" Sarah's blood turned to ice as the figure turned toward the camera, its hollow eyes locking onto hers. Then the screen went black. Terrified, Sarah called the police. When they arrived, they found nothing. No figure, no disturbances. Apartment 708 was locked and empty. The officers chalked it up to stress and isolation. But Sarah knew better. Something was in the building, and it wasn't done with her. That night, Sarah dreamed of Linda. In the dream, Linda sat on the edge of Sarah's bed, her translucent form glowing faintly in the darkness. "You have to help me," she whispered. "He's still here." "Who?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. But Linda's face twisted in fear, and she vanished before she could answer. Determined to uncover the truth, Sarah spent the next day researching the building's history. She discovered that Linda's death wasn't the only one linked to apartment 708. Over the decades, several tenants had reported strange occurrences, voices, shadows, even disappearances. One tenant, a man named Henry Marshall, had been found dead in the apartment's closet, clutching a photograph of a woman who looked eerily like Linda. Sarah's research pointed to one conclusion. Whatever haunted apartment 708 was older and more malevolent than anyone realized. It wasn't Linda. It was something that had claimed her, and others, for itself. On the final night of lockdown, Sarah made a decision. She packed her belongings and prepared to leave. But as she opened her apartment door, the lights flickered, and the hallway stretched impossibly long, as if the building itself was trying to trap her. From behind her, she heard the voice again. This time it was deeper, guttural, and filled with malice. "You can't leave." Sarah turned, and there it was, a shadowy figure with glowing eyes and an aura of suffocating darkness. It lunged at her, and she ran, her screams echoing through the empty halls. When the police arrived the next morning, they found Sarah's apartment empty. Her belongings were scattered, her front door ajar. The only clue was a message scrawled on her bathroom mirror. "He has her now." The building was condemned months later, but rumors persist. Those who pass by on quiet nights swear they can hear whispers from the 7th floor, and if you listen closely, you might hear a voice calling your name. In a small neighborhood in Maplewood, New Jersey, residents were confined to their homes. Among them was Grace, a young nurse who had recently moved to the area. She lived alone in a modest one-bedroom house, her days consumed by virtual meetings and her nights haunted by solitude. But isolation soon turned into something far more sinister. Grace began noticing something odd during the 3rd week of lockdown. Her neighbor, Mr. Wilson, an elderly man who lived alone in the house across the street, would stand at his doorway every evening, staring directly at her window. At first, she thought it was harmless. Perhaps he was just lonely. But over time, his behavior grew more bizarre. He would stand there for hours, motionless, even in the pouring rain. One night, Grace finally summoned the courage to confront him. She stepped out onto her porch, her voice trembling as she called out, "Mr. Wilson, are you okay?" He didn't respond. Instead, he slowly tilted his head, his eyes glinting under the dim streetlights. Then he smiled, a wide, unnatural grin that sent chills down her spine. Without a word, he turned and went back inside, leaving her heart pounding with unease. The following week, a storm hit Maplewood. Rain lashed against Grace's windows, and the power went out, plunging her home into darkness. Grabbing a flashlight, she made her way to the kitchen to light some candles. As she rummaged through a drawer, she heard a faint tapping. At first, she thought it was just the storm, but then it came again, louder this time. The sound was coming from her living room window. Her heart raced as she approached the window, flashlight in hand. With trembling fingers, she pulled back the curtain. Standing outside, barely visible in the darkness, was Mr. Wilson. His face was pressed against the glass, his eyes wide and unblinking. In his hand was a long, rusted knife. She stumbled back, her mind racing. Should she call the police? But before she could reach for her phone, the tapping stopped. When she looked again, he was gone, leaving only muddy footprints on her porch. In the days that followed, Grace began hearing whispers at night. They seemed to emanate from the walls, faint and indistinct, but undeniably real. She couldn't make out the words, but their tone was menacing, filled with malice. Sleep became impossible, her nights consumed by fear. Desperate for answers, she decided to research Mr. Wilson. A quick online search revealed that he had lived in the neighborhood for decades. But what caught her attention was an article from 1995. His wife and two children had mysteriously disappeared, their bodies never found. Though he had been investigated, no charges were ever filed. Her unease grew. She began noticing other strange occurrences. Doors she was certain she had locked were found wide open. Objects moved on their own, and her phone rang with no one on the other end. One evening, Grace decided to take matters into her own hands. Armed with a baseball bat, she crossed the street to Mr. Wilson's house. The door was unlocked, creaking loudly as she pushed it open, revealing a dark, musty interior. She hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The house was eerily silent, the air heavy with a foul stench. As she moved through the rooms, she noticed strange symbols etched into the walls, their meaning unclear. Eventually, she found the basement door, slightly ajar with a dim light spilling out from below. She descended the stairs, her heart pounding. The basement was cluttered with old furniture and boxes, but what caught her attention was a large wooden chest in the corner. As she approached, the whispers grew louder, almost frenzied. With trembling hands, she opened the chest. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, of her. Some had been taken from outside her window, others from inside her home. Beneath the photos was a journal filled with ramblings about offering her to the darkness. Before she could fully process what she was seeing, a cold hand gripped her shoulder. She turned to find Mr. Wilson standing behind her, his eyes filled with an unnatural rage. Grace swung the baseball bat with all her strength, striking Mr. Wilson and sending him sprawling to the floor. She bolted up the stairs, her breath coming in ragged gasps. As she reached the front door, she felt something tugging at her ankle. Looking down, she saw tendrils of shadow coiling around her, pulling her back toward the basement. She screamed, kicking and thrashing until she broke free. Bursting into the night, she ran back to her house and locked the door behind her. But the whispers followed her, louder than ever. It wasn't just Mr. Wilson. Something darker, something inhuman, had been unleashed. The next morning, police arrived at Mr. Wilson's house to find it empty. There was no sign of him or the chest. Grace tried to explain what had happened, but her story was met with skepticism. She moved away from Maplewood soon after, but the whispers never stopped. They followed her wherever she went, a chilling reminder that some shadows can never be escaped. And as the world slowly emerged from lockdown, Grace realized she would remain imprisoned forever, in fear, in isolation, and in the darkness that had claimed her soul. Story 3. The Shadows of the Lockdown. The COVID-19 lockdown in early 2020 changed the world. Cities once bustling with life turned into ghost towns. In a small, cramped apartment complex in Wuhan, the air was thick with fear and desperation. Supplies dwindled, food was scarce. And for families like Daniel's, his wife Hannah, and their 8-year-old daughter Lily, the lockdown was a nightmare of hunger and isolation. At first, people tried to maintain order, distributing food among neighbors and sharing news about aid shipments. But as the days stretched into weeks, desperation began to grow. When the grocery delivery trucks stopped coming and the streets fell eerily silent, paranoia took hold of the residents. One evening, Daniel heard muffled voices outside their apartment door. Peering through the peephole, he saw shadows moving quickly in the dim corridor light. The noises stopped, but when he opened the door to check, he found that the small bag of rice they had left as a trade with their neighbor was gone. "Someone took it," he whispered to Hannah, his voice trembling. "Who would steal from us?" "We're all in the same situation," she replied, holding Lily close. But Daniel knew better. Hunger could turn even the most decent people into thieves. The apartment complex had become a tense battleground. Rumors spread like wildfire about a man on the 12th floor stockpiling food, about families mysteriously vanishing, and about shadowy figures roaming the halls at night. It was on one such night that Lily woke her parents up. "Dad, there's a man standing in the hallway," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Daniel hurried to the peephole. The corridor was empty. "There's no one there, Lily. It must have been a dream." But Lily was insistent. "He was just standing there, staring at our door. His eyes, they were so white, like he didn't have any." Hannah tried to calm her down, but that night, none of them could sleep. 2 days later, the complex descended into chaos. Word got out that someone on the 8th floor had hidden a stash of food. A group of desperate residents broke into the apartment, tearing through cabinets and cupboards, only to find moldy vegetables and a few packs of instant noodles. The fight spilled into the hallway, fists and screams echoing through the building. Daniel locked the door, pushing furniture against it as Hannah covered Lily's ears. "Dad, why are they so angry?" Lily asked, tears streaming down her face. "Because they're scared, just like us," Daniel answered, though deep down he knew fear was only part of the story. Something darker was taking root in the building. That night, the power went out, plunging the building into darkness. The stale air felt heavier, and the silence was unbearable. Daniel lit a candle, its flickering flame casting eerie shadows on the walls. As he sat by the window, trying to keep watch, he thought he saw movement in the street below. Squinting, he noticed pale figures standing motionless in the distance. Their faces were indistinct, but their presence sent a chill down his spine. "Daniel, come to bed," Hannah called softly, pulling him from his thoughts. He turned back to the window, but the figures were gone. The next morning, Daniel ventured out to check on their closest neighbor, Mrs. Johnson, an elderly widow who lived alone. Her door was slightly ajar, which was unusual. Mrs. Johnson was always careful to keep it locked. "Mrs. Johnson," Daniel called, stepping inside cautiously. The apartment was eerily quiet. Dishes were left on the table as if she had been in the middle of a meal, but there was no sign of her. In the corner of the room, Daniel noticed something odd, a trail of dusty footprints leading to the wall. They stopped abruptly, as if Mrs. Johnson had walked straight into it and vanished. That night, Lily woke again. "Dad, the white-eyed man. He's back." Daniel didn't dare look through the peephole this time. He simply tightened his grip on Lily and whispered to his wife, "Don't look. Don't open the door. Just stay quiet." They sat in the darkness, listening to faint footsteps outside their door, until they finally faded away. From that moment on, Daniel knew something sinister had taken over the building, and it wasn't just the desperation of the living. Something from the shadows was watching, waiting. By the next morning, whispers of the previous night's events had spread throughout the building. Another resident, Jacob from the 9th floor, approached Daniel in the hallway. "Did you hear it too?" Jacob asked, his eyes darting around nervously. "Hear what?" Daniel replied. "Footsteps. But they don't sound like normal ones. They echo, like they're coming from everywhere and nowhere at the same time." Daniel hesitated. "Yeah, we heard something, but it was probably just someone walking around." Jacob shook his head. "It's not people, it's them." He leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "The ones who didn't make it, the ones who died." Daniel stepped back. "That's ridiculous." Jacob grabbed his arm. "You think so? Go to the 12th floor. Just go and see." Curiosity gnawed at Daniel despite his better judgment. That night, after putting Lily to bed, he told Hannah he needed to check on something. "Daniel, don't," she pleaded. "We're safer if we just stay here." "I'll be quick," he promised, slipping out the door. The climb to the 12th floor was suffocating. The air felt heavier with each step, and the faint hum of the building seemed to grow quieter. When he reached the top, he was greeted by an unsettling sight. The hallway was covered in dust, as if no one had been there in years. But there were footprints, bare footprints leading from one end of the hall to a single door at the far end. Daniel hesitated, his breath catching in his throat. He moved closer, each step echoing eerily in the silence. Reaching the door, he saw something scratched into the wood. "Don't open. They're still here." A sudden sound behind him made him spin around. The hallway was empty, but he could feel it, a presence, cold and watching. Without another thought, Daniel turned and ran back to his apartment. Daniel's encounter left him shaken. He tried to explain it to Hannah, but she dismissed it as stress. "We're all scared, Daniel, but we can't start imagining things," she said, though her voice wavered. That night, the footsteps returned, louder this time. They didn't just pass by the door, they stopped in front of it. Lily clung to her mother while Daniel stood frozen, gripping a kitchen knife. "Dad," Lily whispered, "they're talking. Can't you hear them?" Daniel strained his ears but heard nothing. Lily, however, began to cry. "They're saying we don't belong here, that we need to leave." The doorknob rattled. Daniel stepped forward, his heart pounding, but the noise stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Desperate for answers, Daniel sought out Jacob the next day. He found him in his apartment, frantically packing. "You were right," Jacob said before Daniel could even speak. "This place isn't safe. They're angry. They want us gone." "Who?" Daniel demanded. "Who are they?" Jacob paused, his face pale. "The ones who died here, during the first wave of the virus. Their families couldn't come for them. Their bodies were never taken out. They're still here, Daniel. Trapped." Daniel staggered back, the weight of Jacob's words sinking in. "We have to leave," he muttered. But leaving was easier said than done. The building was surrounded by barricades, and the streets outside were patrolled. They were trapped with the living and the dead.